Hi, welcome to Box on the Box Rock and Celluloid, Bot for short. Coming quite late to the party on this, it's taken me a while to get around to watching it due to having stuff on and the length of it, but I was decided to do a little review of the Beatles Get Back documentary. So I imagine up to now people have probably read quite a bit, some of you will have seen it. But I was just kind of, I felt compelled really just to kind of chip in my tuppence, my reflections on it. So overall, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I watched it in a few sittings because obviously the length of it is nearly 9 hours of material. But the first thing is it's just amazing how Peter Jackson and his team have basically brought the material up to 21st century standards. The quality of the images and the soundtrack, what they've done with the sound is quite amazing because they don't have multi-tracks, they just have mono recordings, and they managed to get into each individual sort of frequency and get better separation for us. So when the Beatles are kind of working up tracks, we can hear what every instrument's doing and how that track develops. I think this works on two levels. If you've played in a band, you're a musician, it's really interesting because any musician watching this will recognise the process of being in a band. And what's interesting is the Beatles, effectively, just like any other band, yeah, they're the Beatles, are the biggest band ever. They've got a team of people in the studio and they've got access to the best gear. But essentially, when they're sat down playing, the same things are happening that happen in bands that just, go to crappy practice rooms all over the UK and America and other places. You have good sessions where something happens and other times you're kind of frustrated and not getting very far. And so it's interesting to see that. And when they turn up, there's a bit where George Harrison turns up with his guitar case and just, oh, morning lads. And that's just, that's what happens in a practice, if you turn up 5 minutes late, people might already be there or the drummer might be there setting up. Usually drummers tend to get there earlier because they've got more to set up. You're like, oh, all right, mate, they're already in. And this is what happens at band practices everywhere, unless the band doesn't get along and hates each other. But I think that's kind of a myth. I think watching this, it dispels quite a few myths. The idea that the Beatles weren't getting on. Typically on the original Let It Be film, we typically see the image, the sequence with Paul and George having a bit of a set to. Paul's like, oh, could you play this? And I don't mind what you're playing. George is like, oh, well, I'll play anything to make you happy, and it's all a bit tense. And that's become the kind of the standard thing. The Beatles. George is falling out with Paul. Yoko's there and broken up the Beatles. We'll come to that. But that's not the case when you see all this footage. Yeah, there's bits where things are a little tense. There's points where things aren't happening. A lot of the time the band are messing around, jamming, playing songs alike that they used to play, old hits. And really what they're doing is they're just kind of getting the juices going, really. But also what's interesting, how long it takes for a song to develop. We see the fledgling versions of songs like Get Back and so on, and songs that aren't and haven't been, weren't recorded by the Beatles. But we recognise because of the John Lennon solo tracks and so on. But it's interesting seeing that, they're just trying to find a way in. If you look at a song like Get Back, it's just a basic sort of rock and roll, it's just a kind of shuffle. But, the way it develops and the way the band put their little bits in and the way McCartney's vocals develop, it just starts to take on more and become something special. There's a really interesting bit where they're debating the first line. Obviously, we know it as Jojo left his home in Tucson, Arizona. But the original line is Jojo Jackson left his home in Arizona. So it's just a slight thing that John and Paul are kind of debating this. What works better? Now, the Jojo Jackson line is kind of more on the beat, it's more snappy. But the word Tucson goes over the beat and kind of stretches more. And that kind of makes it more catchy. It's just little things like that. The weird thing is with this, I said to a mate, it's like when you watch a detective story, you have a restricted narrative and an omniscient narrative. And the Beatles in this film are in a restricted narrative. They don't know what's happening next, but we do. We know the history of this. We know there's going to be a concert on the rooftop. We know that Get Back goes Jojo left his home in Tucson, Arizona. That is the opening line, not Jojo Jackson. But when the Beatles are writing this, they don't know that. They're deciding that. And that's really fascinating to me. So I think for non-musicians, it's a bit of an education. If you're a Beatles fan or you're not a Beatles fan, you should watch this and understand what bands do. Typically, people's, so detached from music listening and the work that goes into it, particularly with streaming and the endless flow and also the monetization of music, the idea that it's kind of almost become free, or you can't access it for free. People need to watch this. This hasn't changed. The Beatles, this might be 1969, but people are still working their butts off in practice rooms, or they're working their butts off in their own little home studio, sending stuff to their mate in another studio and so on. The process has become more modernised, but essentially that finger grease, that legwork starts to go in. The Beatles are going in at 10 in the morning till 6 at night, which is actually quite early. That's really disciplined. I mean, anyone's a musician out there will know that musicians aren't morning people. And you typically hear stories of bands, doing late night sessions in the studio. But the Beatles have been very disciplined here. They've got families, they've got partners, young kids, things to attend to. So yeah, they've got this disciplined structure of going in at 10 in the morning, finishing at 6, and generally they work all day. So the key point in this, they're in the Shepperton studios, I think, or is it Twickenham? Sorry. And the vibe's not happening there. So when we typically see a lot of footage from the original Let It Be film, they're in the studio, it seems cold, there's various people milling around. Then they move to Apple Studios, and then the vibe changes. You can clearly see John's happier. John's more like the John Lennon we imagine. George has actually already left the band in the first part. They have a meeting off camera and stuff squared out, and George comes back. I think what happens is basically they know the game's up. John, Paul, Ringo, they go for a meeting at George's house. I think what happens there is they discuss the progression of the documentary, and they probably come to the decision, we'll do this, then we'll do one more album, which is going to be Abbey Road, and then we'll call it a day. So this idea that Yoko split up the Beatles, the Beatles were already in the process of splitting up bands. They don't go into a practice room and they go, right, I'm leaving, we're splitting up. They reach a natural conclusion where people, A, want to do other things, or the band's run its course. And the Beatles have run its course creatively. Not totally, because they did Abbey Road, but you can see John Lennon's drifting. He's getting less writing credits. It's very much Paul's songs. A lot of Paul's songs they're doing. He's really driving it, trying to keep it going. George has got songs he's trying to bring in. And he's getting really frustrated. You can feel he's frustrated. He's bringing in brilliant ideas. The strange bits where George is bringing in these songs that are going to be genius songs, and they're wanting to work on Maxwell's Silver Hammer or Ringo's Octopus's Garden. That's an interesting bit there, which we'll come to. So you can see that people need to move on to do other things. There's various people milling around, but not a lot. It's not like the Beatles have got a massive sycophantic crew. There's Mal Evans, who's the kind of roadie guy. He seems to be writing down lyrics sometimes for them as well. When they're riffing around, he seems to be jotting stuff down to help them. And he's just like a really great guy. He's just a guy who's quiet. He's there, getting whatever they need. If they need gear, he goes out and gets it. There's a director, Michael Lindsay Hogg, who comes across really well. Really organised, focused guy. Seems to smoke a lot of cigars. You got George Martin there, who's not producing the sessions. He's just there in a kind of, I'm here to help out. And then Glyn Johns is engineering. Glyn Johns, he's probably the one guy who's dressed in the kind of 60s French. If you all know what era it was, he's got some great outfits. But again, a really mellow guy, really encouraging when needs to be. Knows when to step in and just go, hey, what about this? That might sound good, but he knows he doesn't need to, produce the Beatles so much. He's really good. And then there's various engineers and tape ops, but there's not a lot of people. And then now bands, you can't imagine bands have massive crews, have massive organisations, and the Beatles were in the process of that with the Apple Corps, which I think was kind of their undoing. I think they're happiest playing music in a room, the four guys, and when you get them doing that, you can see on the docu, that's going well. When the business side of things comes in, although you don't see much of that, that's where the issues are. And later on, John will go off for meetings with Alan Klein about obviously managing, etc. but Paul doesn't mention this, I don't think, but he's seeing Linda Eastman, soon to be Linda McCartney, and her dad Lee Eastman, and Paul wants him to manage his affairs, and that's what that's one of the things that'll split the Beatles. So there's that. There's people moving on with their lives, people wanting to explore different. George needs to get his songs out there. John doesn't seem as interested in writing songs as much. Not in a kind of nasty way. It's not like, oh, Paul, I'm not working on a song. He just seems more laissez-faire, Paul's really keen to create, and he's trying to keep it going, but there's a bit where he gets emotional because he knows, well, I can't really. There's one bit where John doesn't show up, George is gone. At that point, it's just him and Ringo, and a couple of other guys sat at the table. Ringo is just always there. He just turns up on time. He's really pro, and he'll just sit there, listen to Paul's ideas, and he'll just play. He doesn't, he's not a writer, or as a one bit we'll come to. But he's great. He's just happy just to kind of support his bandmates and do the musical thing that he always did on the drums. There's a bit where he's working on Octopus's Gardens, he's just tinkling on the piano, and then George actually comes over to help him on it. And I thought this was a lovely bit, because I remember George, he's frustrated that he's not getting his songs in, and Octopus's Garden's not, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, or If I Needed Someone. But he sits there and he goes, oh, see, you've learnt A minor, and he just gives Ringo a bit of encouragement. I just thought that was great. So little moments like that, that's in the kind of second half when they're at the Apple Studios, when they move there and the vibe's more up. And then there's a lot of humour. John and Paul, George, I think George is a little more reserved. I think George is maybe, more, 1 foot out the door than the rest of them. But they're having a good laugh. And it's just fascinating just to see them messing around and creating stuff. Paul McCartney in particular, there's bits where he's on the piano, he's playing this. He's working on Let It Be. If you're in any doubt of this guy's genius, you need to watch this. And I think one of the things the documentary does, and before people say it's had influence, it's produced by Olivia Harrison and Yoko, Peter Jackson, Donald Edding. I think Paul McCartney's just left them to it. I think it reclaims McCartney as, the great genius and guy he is. For years it's been like, oh, George is the coolest Beatle. John's songs are better, Paul's, too kind of poppy. But when you watch this, McCartney's a fucking genius. He's working really hard and he's really easy to work with, I think. And he's cool. Paul's cool here. He's got a beard. He looks cool. John's cool. George is cool. And guess what? Ringo's cool as well. The Beatles are cool. There doesn't need to be competition. There's a reason why they're the Fab Four. They're all cool. They all had the vibe. And they all contributed to that whole. And they spent all that time together, going back, obviously 3 of them to the Quarrymen, Ringo coming in later, but by the time we see this, they've been together a long time, and it was the right thing for them to split up, make the Abbey Road album. The only sad thing at the end was the Let It Be kind of like left to Phil Spector, and he swamped it in his strings, and they'd lost interest by then, and obviously McCartney came back to it and did the Let It Be naked, and I think McCartney was criticised for that at the time. Oh, it's Paul, taking over, but in actual fact, I suspect that was the right thing to do, and again reclaimed the purity of the recordings that you can see in these in the documentary. The gig on the roof's great extra footage, and the great thing about that, it captures Britain. I think there's great street scenes of just regular people, and they've just been interviewed what they think about the Beatles. There's a great guy goes, oh, he's an older guy with a hat. He's I think they're really good. And then they say, oh, would you want one of your daughters to marry one of them? He goes, well, yeah, of course I would. They've got money. It was brilliant. And when the police turn up and you got the bobbies with the hats, and they don't look a lot different to now. And I think the other thing is, I always talk about the swinging 60s myth, this idea that everyone's on Carnaby Street with flowers in their hair. A lot of people just dress very normally. They're just generally working people, middle-class office-type people. It's just regular life in Britain being caught in London. And there's actually a cool red sports car, and I think it's a Lamborghini, and I meant to look up the model for it, but it might be George's, I don't know. But if you look at the live footage at the end on the street, there's an E-Type, you'll see like a red sports car, it's a Lamborghini, probably mid-60s one. So what else? Yeah, the run-throughs of the tracks are really cool on the gig. you know, they did get back a couple of times. The last version, I think I've Got Feelings really good. Paul's vocal's great. And there's a bit where Paul looks over and he sees the coppers and then he goes, woo, you know, he does one of his woozy laughs. And they're having a good time, you know. The great bit on that is John and Paul are kind of looking at each other and they're doing harmonies, and the harmonies are really good, you know, sometimes a little pitchy but in a good way. And I'm not sure what harmony, you know, George is singing on one track. But, you know, it's just really good, and Ringo's tight. And, yeah, you know, they've got brand new Fender twin amps and that, you know. That's the other thing. They've got the great Billy Preston as well. There's a bit in Apple Studios when they first go there. Billy Preston comes along. He comes down quite by accident to see them, and then they start jamming. Everyone lights up, you know, because he's bringing that extra ingredient into things, and you can just see the whole band are like really galvanised by that. And yeah, it's the you know, when they start off things are a bit drab, they're a bit stuck. Then they get the vibe better, and then by the time of the gig, you know, although they don't know, they've got legendary footage and you know, recordings that are, you know, part of the musical lexicon. So I found it fascinating. And finally, just a word about Yoko. Yoko is there, sat by John's side. At the time, she'd had a miscarriage close to that. She wanted to be with John. John obviously wanted her to be close. My feeling is his bandmates were like, whatever John needs, because his bandmates and his mates. And Yoko's presence, although strange having your girlfriend right by your side while your band's writing stuff, she's fine. There's one bit where, you know, they're kind of having a screaming jam and George has gone and she's shouting George, which, yeah, could be a trigger for people. But I think you just got to understand is that Yoko Ono was John's partner. They'd been through a lot of stuff. They were big celebrities. She probably couldn't be left on her own. She couldn't got bothered. So it's better that she was with John, and it was better for the band to keep John happy. And that's, you know, she didn't break up the Beatles. There's nothing she's doing in there breaking up the Beatles. The only thing I would say is she may have been privy or gone to the meeting of Alan Klein. She may have been more in John's ear, this Alan Klein guy's good, and that would cause a schism with Paul. But, you know, creatively, they're already starting to go apart, and there's nothing wrong with that. People are always like, oh, why the Beatles break up? It's good the Beatles broke up. They finished on an amazing album, Abbey Road. They had an amazing time, and they didn't need to keep going. And they all produced good music afterwards. You know, you got a triple album from George Harrison as a classic, and so on. So that's my take on it. Check it out; it's really good. And thanks for checking this out. Cheers, thanks a lot. Bye.